spring thaw in 1992 and ice jams on the river caused a flood in the state's capital. On the morning of the flood, Montpelier High School principal Peter Clark faced several critical questions.
Should he evacuate the school, release the students to go home? Would the floodwaters continue to rise, or would those waters recede so students could remain in school? The school's emergency plan called for him to consult with the superintendent.
But the superintendent couldn't get to work. That's when the plan broke down.
Well, looking back at the flood, the easiest decision that we made was to dismiss school. I mean, that was almost a no-brainer. It's what happened after that really concerned a lot of us. And that's where the lack of a plan really, I think, put us at a disadvantage. For example, we were slow to dismiss because, given the emergency nature of the situation, I wasn't able to get to the superintendent. And we didn't have a backup plan for who was going to make that decision. So we probably dismissed a little bit later than we should have, given those circumstances.
Peter Clark learned several critical lessons that day.
And I think it's really hard to convey this to people if they haven't been through an emergency. And the problem with emergencies is that they happen so rarely. Maybe there'll be an emergency once in my professional career. Is that how quickly they happen. I never really knew that water could rise that fast. And so after we made the decision to dismiss the students into the community, a real important question was, well, what happens then? Should I have sent teachers with them? Will there be community emergency volunteers available to get them home? I mean, in our community, we don't bus. I mean, only part of our school system is bus. So my kids were walking. So I basically sent my students out into what was a growing emergency situation.
For Clark, the most obvious lesson was that Montpelier dodged a bullet. Nothing bad happened to the students, but the potential was there.
And my assumption was that there would be public employees, policemen, firemen, etc., at key junctures to meet them. But because the effort that when we dismissed was not coordinated as a community as a whole, those people arrived in their positions very slowly, and for a good part of the time, I had students walking through ankle-deep to knee-deep water with really no supervision and guidance, and given the nature of high school kids, some of them thought that was a game.
For the most part, Montpelier's emergency plan worked very well. That community was prepared.
And so what I think we learned out of the situation is that probably the easiest thing to do in an emergency situation is to say, this is an emergency, we need to get the kids out of here. What is harder to do is to coordinate all of the efforts of the community, because I think they need to be coordinated after you make that decision in terms of how you're going to handle it, and who's going to be in charge, and who's going to know what's going on, and where should all the information come. And we learned as we went along that there needed to be a central command. We set all that up, and we learned by experience.
Montpelier has talked about emergencies as a community. They also know that a solid, well-thought-out plan is a resource for all city employees.
We know what it is that we're supposed to do. And while I may not think about it at every single moment in time, I know where that emergency plan is. I know who to call. The person the people who have different responsibilities throughout the community know what their responsibilities are. And if they forget, they can look them up.
Principal Clark says the time his staff spent updating their emergency plan after the 1992 flood was well worthwhile.
When you think about the amount of time you have as an administrator, and you're thinking about planning for something that may never happen or maybe happen once in your professional career, there's a tendency to push it down to the low priority of where things need to be. But in reality, it didn't take us that long to pull it together.